The place historically that students have messed up on the exam has to do with proration and specifically your real property taxes. Proration of real property taxes. Now I want you to think about this. When it comes to your real property taxes, you are going to be, when we went over the offer to purchase contract, I pointed this out to you, but I said, don't worry about it right now. It will come into play later. Now is later. Your contract, the offer to purchase contract said this: your taxes will be prorated on a calendar year basis. There's two important things. They're going to be prorated on a calendar year basis. When does a calendar year start? January 1st. This is a calendar year. You don't know the answer to this, so I will answer it for you. When does a calendar year end? And the answer is December 30th. In this class, for this exercise, we use what's known as a banker year. A banker year is 12 months. Well, that's familiar. 30-day months. Each month has 30 days. Okay? So let's try and experiment on this. Aaron, how many days does June have? 30. Okay? Well, that was right anyway. That wasn't even true. How about May? How many days does May have? 30. How about little February? 30. In this exercise, every month has 30 days. Are you with me? So, bless you. A calendar year is January 1st through December 30th. And you're going to be prorated based on this. Now, here's the problem with this. It's dependent on what time of the year that the deal closes. So, for example, Liz, when's your birthday? June 10th. No, it's not. When's yours? Good gosh, does anybody have a birthday that's not in June? When's your birthday? Her birthday is February 22nd. Just go. February 22nd. Let's assume that our closing date is February 22nd. So let me ask you this question. Closing on 2/22, has the seller paid any taxes yet in this calendar year, for this calendar year?
Yes.
No. No, because the taxes are not due till when? They're not due until September 1st. As a matter of fact, the seller couldn't have paid taxes even if they wanted to, because a tax bill has not yet gone out in this calendar year. Would you agree with that? All right, well, let's think about this for just a moment. The seller has been living there till February 22nd, from January 1st to February 22nd in this year, and hasn't paid any taxes for this year. That doesn't sound fair. Let's make it fair at the closing table. In other words, let's have the seller take what he owes on taxes and let's give it to somebody. Here's how we're going to do that. Let's say that the taxes for the year are $720. By the way, this will either have to be stipulated or we'll have to give you a method for solving for the taxes, right? Do you remember the tax formula? Assessed value divided by 100 times tax rate. So we'll either give you that number or make you solve for it. But either way, the taxes are $720 for the year, right? What I would do if I were you, when it comes to prorating, the first thing I would do is figure out how much those taxes are per day. So in other words, take 720 and divide it by what?
360.
Divided by 360. So the taxes are going to be $2 per day. At some point during this exercise, I hope you start jumping to the next logical conclusion. Well, if the taxes are $2 per day, the question becomes, how many days has the seller used and not paid any taxes on?
January 1st to 2/22.
How many days were there in January? 30. And how many days in February so far? 30 plus 22 is how many? 52 days, and each one of those days was worth how much? $2 per day. Okay. What do you think about the math? The math was not extraordinarily complicated, right? 52 days times $2, 104. The question becomes, what are we going to do with that money? Now remember, at the closing table, we're not dealing with dollar bills. We're dealing with debits and credits, correct? Okay. So would you agree we're going to take that money right there from the seller? $104 debit seller. Does that sound right? Okay. Now, here's where it gets a little bit hairy. Once we take that money from the seller, what do we do with it? We can't pay the tax office because there's not a tax bill yet. Not going to put it in the escrow account. We're going to credit the buyer. We're going to credit the buyer that money. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to debit the seller and we're going to credit the buyer $104. Notice what I just said. We're going to debit the seller how much? We're crediting the buyer how much? 104. In other words, we're not trying to solve for 720. We're trying to make it fair. Hey buyer, here's my share of the money. I'm going to give it to you. The seller takes it out of his pocket, gives it to the buyer. Now, when the buyer comes due on September 1st, he already has the seller's money from earlier in the year, correct? And then on September 1st, the buyer pays the whole thing. Now, the buyer may forget that he got $104 at closing, even though it's on the settlement statement, now what we call the CD, closing disclosure. So he has a record of this. But it's not like the buyer's going to say, well, I'm not going to pay that first $104, I wasn't living. Yes, you will. If you don't, it's going to be a lien on your property, right? So we take from the seller, we give to the buyer. Did that make it fair? Buyer's going to pay the rest of the tax, or the whole tax bill on September 1st. You feel okay about that? Okay. So you're probably asking yourself, I don't understand, Chris. This doesn't seem that difficult. With a little bit of practice, I feel like I'll be able to handle this pretty easily. And you know what, you will. But the problem with taxes are, there are 3 ways to handle the prorations, because everything doesn't close on February 22nd, does it? All right? There's going to be a second scenario. Let's take a look at the second scenario. Matter of fact, if you're making notes, the note you might want to write to yourself on this is exactly the way it's going to look for transactions closing prior to September 1st. This example right here, closings happening before September 1st. If you would like me to tell you a trick on the exam, listen closely. If we tell you that you're closing on February 22nd, that is before September 1st, if we tell you we're closing before September 1st, we won't even tell you whether these taxes have been paid or not. What are you to assume? You're to assume they haven't been paid because the tax bills have not even gone out yet, okay? So far, so good. Let me give you something to compare it to so you can see why the complexity. Okay. Next scenario, watch this. We are closing on, closing is taking place on October the 18th. What do you notice about October the 18th? It is after what day?
September 1st.
It's after September 1st. I'm going to tell you 2 things. First thing I want to tell you is that your taxes were $1,080 for the year. Your taxes are $1,080 for the year. Okay? Taxes are $1,080 for the year. But there's one critical piece of information you need to know to solve this problem. And in fairness, we have to tell you. Have the taxes been paid? Yes, I'm going to tell you. Your taxes for the year are $1,080 and they have been paid. In other words, after September 1st, the problem has to tell you. Okay? Now, who's living in the house on September 1st? Seller. Seller was clearly living in the house on September 1st. He paid the whole tax bill of $1,080, right? Now, here's the problem. The buyer is going to be living in the property part of the year. Wouldn't it be fair if he had to pay part of the taxes? What part of the taxes do you think he should pay? How about the time that he lives there? Okay? So is he going to live there all of December? All of November? And then how many days in October? 12, the remainder of the month. 12 days. 30 minus 18 is 12. So would you agree, 30 plus 30, there's December, November, plus 12 in October. Looks like 72 days, is that correct?
Yes.
72 days, and then how much were the taxes per day? Yeah, 1,080 divided by 360 would be $3 per day. Can you see okay, Gail? Okay, so 72 days times $3, $216 prorated. Pause right there for just a moment. Does everybody understand how we got to 216? Okay. Now we have to make this fair. So in this problem, the seller has already paid the taxes. So what would make this fair if we took it from whom? Buyer debit. Okay. And then what are we going to do with this money after we take it from the buyer? We're going to credit to the seller. Well, this time I did it a little bit backwards, but debit buyer, credit seller. And how much are we going to take from the buyer? 216. How much are we going to give to the seller? 216. Why didn't we give this money to the tax office? Taxes have already been paid. Taxes have already been paid. Let's just give it to them. I like to think of this one as just simply being the buyer reimbursing the seller for taxes that he has paid. Okay? Questions or comments about this one?
About this scenario?
Sure.
So what if you don't pay till January 1?
Taxes haven't been paid yet.
Well, it's not about when you pay them. It's about when you close.
No. As a seller, it's due on January 1.
They're due when? September 1st.
September 1st.
Yeah, they're due September 1st.
But if you have to pay them.
That's what the next example will be. I'm sorry. That's what the next example will be. This one is late in the year paid, and Terry brings up the next question. What's it going to look like if it's late in the year unpaid? So you'll get to see a third scenario. Questions about the first or second scenarios? Do you understand what I mean by the math itself is not hard? But are you starting to see what the problem is? When you read a problem, you're going to have to pick which one of these methods do you use. The first scenario, early in the year, unpaid. Second scenario, late in the year, and by late in the year I mean after September 1st, paid, which means I only have one thing left. Late in the year, unpaid. Can I erase what's on the board? Okay?
The first example was early in the year unpaid.
Correct. Before September 1st, they're always going to be unpaid. Okay? Second scenario, late in the year paid, and by late in the year I mean after September 1st.
So the buyer reimburses the seller.
That's exactly right. Correct. This next one's a little tricky. But don't forget, just stop and think about it and see if it makes sense to you. This next scenario, we are closing on December 12th. We are closing on December the 12th. Now here's what's going on in this case. The taxes for the year are $1,440. You start reading the test question, you see that the closing is December 12th, and you see that the taxes are $1,440 for the year. There's one critical piece of information that we have to tell you. Yes, in this case, the taxes are unpaid because we said so. Because the test question said so. Unpaid. All right. Now the question becomes, how do we resolve this? Would you agree with me that the taxes are $1,440 divided by 360 will be $4 per day? They equal $4 per day. Okay? Now, think about this. If these taxes are not paid, there's going to be a lien against this property. The last thing that the attorney wants is for there to be a lien on this property after closing. So the attorney's going to look at the two parties, and he's going to say, hey parties, why don't both of you bring your respective share to closing, and then what I'll do is I'll take it from my trust account and I will pay the tax office myself. That way I know that they're paid. So the attorney, in this case, will collect the respective shares from the parties. How much is the buyer's share going to be? How many days is that? 18 days. 18 days times $4 per day. The buyer is responsible for $72, and the seller is going to be responsible for the rest of the year, right? What I would recommend you do is solve for the buyers first, and then subtract that from the sellers. It doesn't matter on this problem, but what you'll find out in the future is it minimizes rounding issues if you'll do it this way. Solve the buyers first. and then subtract to get the seller's. So it looks like the seller's part is going to be, what's that, 1368 maybe? 1,368. Now, how are we going to take care of this from a debit and credit scenario? So I'll give you a hint. There are no credits. It's going to be a double debit, right? That's what we call a double debit. Debit to the seller, oh, sorry, forget you ever saw that. Debit to the buyer, the little number. Debit to the seller, the big number. And when we say debit, they're both going to pay into the attorney's trust account, and then the attorney will simply write a check to the tax office. Because remember, it's after September 1st, so the attorney already has the tax bill, correct? So your tax prorations, let me ask you two questions again. First of all, the math on it. Did you find the math to be complex? So what are you going to find to be complex? You have to make a relationship between what point of the year, what point of the year that the transaction closed, and whether the taxes were paid or unpaid. Okay? That's the problem right there. Okay?